Along with individual differences, organizational culture really has a huge impact on the way that we make decisions and the expectations and the norms around the way one should make decisions or what outcomes one would expect to see given a certain decision. And that's, in essence, culture is the way that we frame and organize our attitudes and values and expectations that are shared among all members of an organization. So in essence, it's taking the individual differences and it's looking at what we share in common in terms of our attitudes, values, and behaviors. Culture comes in a couple of different layers. It can be visible and conscious, where we look at artifacts and layouts and symbols and slogans. It can be invisible but conscious, where it's an expressed idea, and then we know that this expressed idea is very consistent with the values of the company. Or it can be these underlying assumptions that we don't even think about. We just seem to know that this is the right way things are and the way things are going to be, and it's not something anybody has ever put words to or cognition to, but we all know there's no way it would be any different than the way it is now. It has to be this way in order for it to be part of this organizational culture. Culture is created really in an ongoing way. Every new person that enters the company certainly influences the culture and tweaks it in a little way so that it changes very incrementally, but nonetheless it does change. And unless there's a radical intervention, culture doesn't change with any kind of speed. It's usually a very slow, glacial process, if you will. But the initial company culture and the way it's established usually comes from a number of different sources. Number one, from the company founders. I mean, if you look at Southwest Airlines and Herb Kelleher, you look at Steve Jobs and Apple Computers, these maverick leaders or heroes, whatever we want to call them, determined what they thought the company culture should be, the way they thought things needed to be done. And so they started inculcating those values and behaviors into the people that worked in that company. And so that became something that became taken for granted, and it's just what people do. We also can develop our culture based on what's going on in our external environment. And if we come about in an environment where it's been really volatile, we may become very good at adapting to volatile circumstances. You know, if the company came into fruition in a very stable environment, that's going to influence our culture as well, and may give us some troubles when the environment is not so stable. And so we're very much influenced by what goes on in the real world, whether there are ethical violations or ethical lapses, or whether there are, political and historical trends going on out there that really have an impact on, global culture and individuals. These things, affect us. Certainly, we can look at Enron and what happened with Enron and how that influences every corporate culture now in terms of being very mindful of ethics violations. I mean, that's where Sarbanes-Oxley came out of. So now not only has it changed legislation, but that legislation has also changed corporate cultures in the way that they think about ethics and whistleblowing and things like that. Any contact with others inside the organization, the way people interact also will tweak and adjust and adapt the culture every so slightly. But as I said, it's not something that changes overnight. It takes a really long time for culture to change. What role, then, does culture play in this whole process? Well, culture gives the company their identity. It gives them a sense of who they are, what they stand for, what they're all about. Just as our attitudes and values give us an identity, corporate culture gives the company its identity. It helps us to know what the company culture is because it keeps us in alignment with the organization's mission. Or certainly that's the goal of the corporate culture, is to keep us in alignment with the organization's mission. But ultimately what the culture does is it tells us this is what you can do, this is why you should do it, and here are the repercussions if you don't and the rewards if you do. Stay consistent with the company culture and its expectations and around behaviors. Each company has a unique culture, so where does that uniqueness come from and how can we interpret what it is that we're seeing? recognize, first of all, that there's not any one single culture in the company. I mean, there may be some broad strokes. You know, these are our consistencies, but we might also see actually very little subcultures, and some cultures that may be more dominant than others around things. But these multiple cultures develop across departments, across projects. This group has a culture because they are in St. Louis versus the group that's over in Washington State versus the one that's in Southern California. Each division, department, branch, all experiences different cultures and subcultures. There may be some consistencies, and there should be consistencies across all of those companies, but the bottom line is they will never be completely identical because each culture is influenced not just by, you know, the people, but also, which will be different in and of itself, but also by the surroundings within which they're working. And so if you're working in a surroundings in St. Louis, it's very different than the Northwest and very different than Southern California culture, as we've talked about. And as I said, culture will change over time. It's just at a very glacial, incremental pace. And it's also really important to know that cultures don't have a a value in and of themselves as being good or bad. They're just different. Short of a company culture that pretty much says, you know, you can lie, cheat, and steal, and that's okay. Not so much, obviously, because not only does it violate the law, but it violates a lot of ethical norms. But nonetheless, as a rule, cultures aren't good or bad. They're just different. There may be dimensions of the culture that may be challenging, or individuals who might express that culture in unique ways, but nonetheless, cultures, as a rule, don't have a value judgment. It's how people tend to manifest them and how they behave around them that makes the difference. Because culture influences individual core values and corporate core values, how do we see that manifesting itself in the organization? Number one, we might see it in the form of a greater sensitivity to the needs of customers and employees. And Southwest Airlines is a great example of a company that says, when our employees are happy, our customers are happy. And I know we've already talked about that in class. We may also see it influencing the way that we gather information from our employees and how open we are to allowing them the autonomy to generate new and exciting ideas. The more open we are to those ideas, the more open the culture is. Culture influences risk. Some cultures are more prone to risk, some cultures are less prone to risk. It may depend on the industry, it may depend on the individuals running the company, it may depend on the national culture in which the company exists and functions. Some of the national cultures are more risk-taking than others. Middle Eastern culture tends to not be very risky, whereas U.S. culture tends more towards risk. Not only does culture reflect how sensitive we may be to the needs of our customers' employees, but also the value that we place on them. If we really truly value our employees, then we'll engage in certain behaviors. And if we don't value them and we think of them as just commodities that can be thrown away, it's a totally separate animal. How open the communication is a great example of culture. What you can and cannot say, what is allowed to be communicated and what is supposed to not be talked about. And then, again, how friendly and congenial people are towards each other. All of these factors are just great examples of how culture manifests itself. The double S cube of culture gets at two key dimensions for corporate cultures. One is the degree of sociability, which means how friendly or connected people feel to other members of the corporation or the organization. And then the solidarity, which means sort of how well do they work together towards the common goal. It doesn't mean that they have to like each other, and they're not necessarily sociable to have solidarity. Solidarity is really, do we all agree to the goals and work towards the goals? Sociability is about the degree to which we actually get along and we like each other's company. And there's a 2x2 matrix, which we'll see on the next slide, that addresses how those things work. In a culture that is high in sociability, meaning people get along, they enjoy each other's company, and they're high in solidarity, meaning they have very clear ideas of what the goals are, and they're all working together in a unified way towards those goals. That's what we would call a communal culture, where they get along really well, they like each other, and they all can work together interdependently towards the company goals. When there's high sociability, but not a lot of solidarity, they're not always necessarily working towards the same goals, but they like each other. We see that sort of thing in a networked culture, where, you know, I do my thing, you do your thing, and all our things combined will help the organization move forward, but we like each other, so that we don't have debates and fights over things. We just are working at different paces and towards different goals that will communally bring the organization forward, or collectively would probably be a better word. It collectively brings the organization forward. When there's high solidarity, meaning we, again, are all working towards the same goal, but we don't always necessarily like each other, we call that a mercenary culture. And again, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's simply just saying that, you know, we don't have to like each other and be friendly. We're worker bees, and we put our nose down and we get our job done. We all work like a machine, a well-oiled machine, towards the company goal, but it doesn't mean we like each other and hang out and enjoy each other's company. In the circumstances where we have very low sociability, meaning we don't get along very well, and we're not all working towards good interdependent goals, it's a fragmented culture, which means there are people doing all sorts of things in all different ways, and there's very little that's bringing us together, if you will. And that, I wouldn't necessarily call that a bad culture, but it certainly can be a dysfunctional culture. It's not bad, it just has its challenges. And it might work in some contexts, although I haven't to date been able to think of a context within which a fragmented culture would seem to work best, but maybe you guys can come up with some ideas on that. One interesting and generic way we can describe cultures besides this double S cube of culture would be around 4 basic terms: either a baseball team culture, a club culture, an academy culture, or a culture that's basically trying to survive. They're like in survival mode. And in those cultures, all 4 of those cultures, the struggle, of course, is, you know, how do we achieve success within the context of that culture? Which culture is more conducive in which environments? And a baseball team culture is typically associated with things like software development and stuff like that, where it's a very high-risk, high fast-pacing environment. There are high flyers, just like free agents in the baseball team, where, you know, everybody's really good. They're good utility players, and then you've got these free agents who are just amazing athletes, and they're the ones that all the teams fight over. In the software development industry, and then, you know, during the dot-com, growth era, people could move from company to company if they had, even a pulse with really decent skills. They were highly sought after, and so they could move from company to company very quickly, and they could make top dollars and rise up very fast. And that's like a baseball team, right? It all sort of rotates around the stars. A club culture is more about the stability of an old sort of bureaucratic company where it's in a very stable and secure environment, and there's not a lot of upheavals, and there's a very predictable way that we do things. We promote from within, we like our own, and we pat our own on the back. And this can be good to an extent, but the big challenge we have with club cultures is that they could get very stagnant very quickly, and the loyalty, while a good thing, may end up in things like groupthink. And when the environment is not stable, these club cultures really struggle the most. When it's a stable environment, it works perfectly fine. But I'm not sure that there are any inherently stable environments anymore, given the global economy. Everything seems to be shifting.